Great. Thanks, Richard. So are we good back there, guys? Yep. Okay. My name's Kevin Stewart. I'm the executive director of the Austin Institute for the Study of Family and Culture, and we are very proud to be co-sponsors on this event. I want to introduce briefly the Austin Institute and then tell you a bit about how the debate tonight will work. So the Austin Institute, we have three major buckets of activity. We do original social science research. We also help package and translate good social science research for non-specialist public audiences. So a debate like this is a great example of that. And then additionally, we sponsor and work on programming in and around the campus of the University of Texas at Austin to be good members of the campus community and help form students and form the intellectual community here. And so this debate is a good example of that as well. Debates like this, events like this are really a team effort, and I'm especially proud to be a part of the team here. We are very proud to be co-sponsoring this debate with generous support from the Institute for Humane Studies and from the John Templeton Foundation. We thank them for their generous support. We are particularly proud of our growing tradition of working together on these debates with the Texas Economics Association. And I'd like to introduce the TEA president, Rashard Musaji, and have Rashard say a bit about who and what TEA are for those watching online. So this debate is being live streamed and will be archived. So if there's a point you want to return to, you'll be able to do that. Rashard?
Thank you so much, Kevin. I appreciate it. For those of you who don't know, Texas Economics Association is one of the oldest student economic organizations at the University of Texas at Austin campus. We're founded on 4 pillars: social, professional, philanthropic, and academic. And we have speakers from all around the nation and all different aspects come and visit us and speak about us. So we help to give students a very well-rounded experience, and we're particularly proud of that. So I think that's it for me.
Yep, great. Thanks, Rashard. And now, without too much further delay, I want to introduce our debaters, and we'll get started. One note: when we will have the debate, each debater will have a 10-minute opening, followed by a 7-minute response, and then a 5-minute closing. And then we've left plenty of time for Q&A. When we get to Q&A, because it's being live streamed, please wait for the mic. Do me a favor and wait for the mic. When you raise your hand, Dr. Deanne Stewart here will have a microphone, and she will come to you. And just ask your question into the mic so that the people who are watching can hear the question. So now I'll introduce our debaters. Dr. Michael Hudson is president of the Institute for the Study of Long-Term Economic Trends, a Wall Street financial analyst, distinguished research professor of economics at the University of Missouri, Kansas City, and author of J is for Junk Economics, Killing the Host, The Bubble and Beyond, Super Imperialism, the Economic Strategy of American Empire, Trade, Development, and Foreign Debt, and The Myth of Aid, among many others. Hudson acts as an economic advisor to governments worldwide, including Iceland, Latvia, and China, on finance and tax law. Hudson received his PhD in economics from NYU in 1968. His dissertation was on American economic and technological thought in the 19th century. He received his MA also from NYU in 1963 in economics, with a thesis on the World Bank's philosophy of development and special reference to lending policies in the agricultural sector. Dr. Farhad Rassekh is professor of economics and associate dean in the Barney School of Business at the University of Hartford, where he has been teaching since 1989. In 2007, he received the James E. and Francis W. Bent Award for Scholarly and/or Artistic Creativity. He teaches courses in managerial economics and international economics. His research areas include international trade and the history of economic thought. He has published numerous articles in academic journals, including in the American Economic Review, Review of Economics and Statistics, Economic Inquiry, Review of International Economics, and the History of Economic Ideas. He received his BS in Economics at the National University of Iran in 1976, an MA in Economics from the University of North Texas in 1978, and his PhD in Economics from the University of Houston in 1983. The proposition for tonight is resolved that the U.S. government should support free trade agreements and advance free trade policy. So tonight, in a bit of a turn, because most academic economists, if Greg Mankiw's surveys are to be believed, are free trade proponents. So those are arguments that you may already have been exposed to. At the request of the debaters, the opponent will go first. So Dr. Hudson will go first, and then Dr. Rassekh will respond. In the closing arguments, we will reverse that with Dr. Rassekh finishing us up there. So Dr. Hudson will go first, and Dr. Rassekh will go last at the very end. All right, Dr. Hudson. When you finish, you're welcome to take a seat in one of these chairs.
Oh.
Be closer.
Okay. Well, I had one advantage over any of you that are economic students. When I was taking my PhD, there were no courses in international trade theory at New York University. So all of my background had been as a balance of payments economist for Chase Manhattan Bank and a monetary economist for other banks, and worked for the accounting firm on balance of payments of Arthur Andersen. So when I went, I was invited to teach at the New School for Economic Research in New York. I elected to teach international trade theory because I didn't know anything about it, and I thought the best way to learn about something is to teach it. And imagine my surprise when I actually began to read this literature. The first thing that you read in Paul Samuelson's textbooks or Bill Vickery's textbooks is that they're not talking about reality, that they're talking, the criterion of excellence in economic theory is whether the assumptions are consistent with each other. So we're really talking about literary criticism. How do you write a novel or a film script and have the audience suspend disbelief, but not say, wait a minute, it couldn't have worked that way, because here's what really happens. Here's how the world really works. The whole trick is to get students to begin talking about assumptions and to enter a kind of parallel universe, science fiction world, that doesn't exist but might exist. And the result is you distract attention from how the real world works. So in the 10 minutes that I have, I'm going to talk about 10 assumptions that you're taught, those of you who are unfortunate enough to actually have to take a trade theory course, that are completely unrealistic, and why you're being miseducated along these lines. The first thing is that you find that almost all the free trade arguments say it's going to make the world better, and free trade is going to improve things. No country ever in the past adopted free trade because it was going to make the world better. When England in 1846 adopted free trade and passed the Corn Laws, it was to make a deal. And as they argued in Parliament, if we can get other countries, especially the United States, not to protect their industry, but to export grain and be what the Americans called a hewer of wood and drawer of water, is in the Bible, and they will depend on us for manufacturers, then we will crush them in the cradle. And we will continue to build up our industrial power, and other countries will continue supplying us for raw materials, and they'll all end up dependent on us. And if you look at the Americans, if America would have maintained free trade after the Civil War, we never would have taken off and become an industrial power. Germany would not have taken off. Japan would not have taken off. So every country that has become a world power has become that through protectionist policies at a time when protectionism was the ideal. It was protectionism that was supposed to enable America, Germany, Japan, and other countries to catch up with the most advanced countries by nurturing their own industry and especially their own agriculture, which has always been one of the most highly protected industries. A second assumption is to say free trade is going to make everyone equal. Paul Samuelson got the Nobel Prize for what must be the worst economic idea ever promoted, the factor-price equalization theorem. The fact is, if you look around you for the last 100 years, you can see that the world is not becoming more equal. It's becoming more unequal, more dependent, more polarized. Now, I would have thought that the job of international economics was to explain why is the world becoming more unequal? Why is it polarizing? And instead, you're taught to make these false, unrealistic assumptions that if there were free trade, the world would become more and more equal. And there are a number of then specific economic models, especially as they become financialized, that produce this. It's all of these gains from trade are trade within the status quo. It's a trade of haves versus have-nots. It's doing a deal. But the whole purpose of protective tariffs is to change the status quo, to put in place a industry that's going to have increasing returns instead of diminishing returns in agriculture, to accumulate high productivity. The trade theories all look at labor and capital as sort of antitheses, and the distribution of labor and capital is supposed to make labor-intensive countries that have a lot of labor and not much capital efficient in labor-intensive things like Haitians sewing baseballs, and countries with a lot of capital good at doing what they're doing. There's nothing about how other countries that don't have capital to accumulate it. That's the objective of protectionist policy in every country, to actually do it. So either you have free trade theory based on the status quo, which perpetualizes it, a status quo in a world that is becoming more and more unequal, or you have economic polarization. You can take their pick. Most of the models of trade theory and equilibrium are all based on diminishing returns, and the reality in every industry in the world, from agriculture to mining to manufacturing, has increasing returns. And the objective of most countries has been to achieve high productivity with increasing returns, which they have. There's also another problem with the trade models that you get in academia. They're all based on barter, as if the world is based on barter. There's no money and there's no debt. And already in the mercantilist period of the 18th century, you have English economists such as James Stewart and Hosea Tucker, and even Hume acknowledge that if you can get other countries dependent on you for trade, you will run a balance of payment surplus. They will be in deficit, and once you can push them in deficit far enough, then they end up like Greece is today, having to sell off their domestic resources to foreign investors, just as America was forced to sell off many of its resources to English landlords, to English investors in the 19th century. The tie-in between investment and trade is left out of account of the economic models that you're taught. There's also nothing about tax policy or government policy. When they talk about what are the endowments a country has, as if countries are endowed with labor and endowed with high machinery and factories instead of self-endowing themselves, there's no talk about government policy in endowing and creating these endowments by tax policy, protective tariffs, educational system, public services, such as you have here. There's also an idea that the advantage of labor-intensive countries is that they have low wages and can undersell labor. Well, already throughout the 19th century, you had in the United States protectionists saying there's the economy of high wages doctrine, that high-wage labor undersells low-wage labor because it's more efficient. There are no gunboats, there's no war in the theory, and there's also no externalities. One of the big debates over protectionism in the United States in the 1840s already was about soil depletion. That they said if America continues to export cotton and tobacco and other agricultural goods to England, we're mining the soil. and all throughout the South, from the Atlantic coast all the way west. You forced the westward migration and spread of slavery because the soil was being depleted in these countries. Just as today in Ecuador, you have the case of oil companies coming in, producing oil, which is supposed to be their comparative advantage, and you have oil spills that pollute the water, that destroy the environment, everything really important. Environmental considerations, government policy are considered exogenous. That's the word economists don't like to use. Exogenous means reality. Everything that is exogenous doesn't appear in the model, and if you can get students to have the tunnel vision to do the mathematics of these trade theories that you're taught in the textbooks, then they're going to become very abstract. Many of the professors that teach this may be very smart, but they don't know what to be smart about. Being smart doesn't include being smart about reality. So the result is you have a kind of fictitious theory that's trotted out, and the only way this theory can succeed is by not teaching economic history, not teaching the fact that there's been an alternative to free trade theory that guided American policy from the end of the Civil War through the 1930s and was responsible for America building up its industrial and especially its agricultural productivity. So if there's any discussion of abstract trade theory, those are the assumptions that you want to look out for.
Thank you.
Click the arrow key, and it will take you right to your browser. The right arrow key.
Any arrow key? Oh,
Yeah.
okay. No, all right. Well, hello everyone. I'm not sure how to top that. Everything that I'm going to present here, Professor Hudson already rejected. So let's see how this will shape up. I'm going to start off with some theory, some basic trade theories, but then I will quickly move on to empirical evidence. And this is the reason that I titled my presentation an empirical presentation. Is an empirical evidence provided with regard to the impact of trade on various countries, and then at the end I'll get actually to the United States. Now, I'm not quite sure. I do my presentation now and then respond to his comments or his, okay. Let me also say a few opening remarks here, thanking everyone, Kevin, for inviting me, and it's an honor to be on this stage with Professor Hudson, even though we disagree on many things. Well, as you know, I'm going to defend the free trade position. And I have reached this conclusion based on the evidence, and again, I'll share the evidence with you as much as the time will permit. But I would like to stress the point that free trade doesn't necessarily lead to free everything. In other words, it doesn't necessarily mean free immigration. It doesn't necessarily mean even free flow of capital across countries. I'm going to exclusively focus on the free flow of goods and services across countries. And there are, of course, there are some related or seemingly related issues that I will address. The chances are that I will not have time to go through my entire PowerPoints, so they come up during the Q&A. For example, of the related issues would be outsourcing of jobs, and the issue of the environment that Professor Hudson mentioned, the loss of manufacturing jobs, a hot topic because of globalization or free trade. And these are the issues that I have some evidence to share with you. Now, speaking of disagreeing with each other, I must say that there is nothing new here. There is nothing new under the sun. Go back 2,500 years ago, Aristotle and Plato believed in self-sufficiency. And you had other philosophers of the time, Democritus, for example, who was for free markets. So, and that has continued to our time. So when we are talking about disagreements among economists, even on the trade issue or including the trade issue, it has always been the case. So maybe it's just the nature of the beast. It is my hunch is that it's just the nature of economics as a subject, as a social science. Is not the same as physics as much as we apply more or less the same techniques, more or less the same differential equations and difference equations, all kinds of mathematical tricks that we play in our economic models. Economics should not be viewed as a science such as physics. Is closer to biology, actually, than anything else. Now, here is an economics department. The campus guide is showing the various departments to the prospective parents and students, and get to the economics department, and she is saying, this is our brilliant economics department. And as you can see in this brilliant economics department, every faculty is pointing to a different direction. Now, the one that actually caught my attention is the one at that end that is pointing to different directions. So I hope at the UT Austin you don't have such a faculty on your staff. Now, the origin of modern trade theory. We have to go back about 317 or 16 years to be exact. Henry Martin, 1701, published a treatise. Actually, it was published anonymously. And it was only in 1983 that economic historians discovered that the author of that treatise 300 years earlier was Henry Martin. What did he do? In that small pamphlet, and that was the time when Britain was highly protectionist. 5 years earlier, in 1696, the British Parliament had passed a major piece of legislation prohibiting all kinds of goods from a lot of countries around the world. Now, Henry Martin said in that small pamphlet, Martin demonstrated that, and I'm using this word deliberately, demonstrated that trade expands the productive capacity of the economy. He presented a simple model with some numbers, just some numbers, and showed that trade allows an importing country to produce the same amount of output with fewer resources. This is known as the 18th century rule because many thinkers of the time, such as Adam Smith, applied this. Now, David Hume in 1758 published an important essay called Jealousy of Trade. And this was an essay in which Hume demolished the doctrine of mercantilism, the doctrine that export is good and import is bad. That was essentially what mercantilists believed in, that you should try to export as much as you can and import as little as you can so you can develop trade surplus. Only 5 years or 6 years earlier, in 1752, he had published 4 remarkable essays in which he showed the error of mercantilism, the wrong-headedness, and the fallacy in mercantilist ideas of accumulating as much as you can trade surplus. He showed that it's an impossibility to do so. In 1758, he tackled another issue in trade, and he showed that trade is a positive-sum game. So just as two individuals trading with each other both benefit from it, because if they didn't, they wouldn't engage in the trade or exchange in the first place, two countries as well benefit from trade. But he also argued that trade serves as a channel through which the prosperity of one trading country spills over to another one. In fact, his essential argument was that low-income countries trading with high-income countries will benefit more, and they see their income rising and converging on the high-income countries. I'll get to that later because of some empirical studies validating that claim. So where am I? Adam Smith, 1776. Well, he wrote more than anybody else in that century about trade, arguing about the benefits and the gains from trade and the advantage of trade and so forth. But he began his famous book, The Wealth of Nations, with the notion of division of labor. Because division of labor, specialization increases productivity, but then division of labor, he argued, and he pointed out, that is limited to the extent of the market. So by international trade, you expand the market, and therefore the division of labor becomes more extensive, and therefore productivity rises. And he reached the same conclusion as Henry Martin, but in a different way. And the conclusion was that trade increases the productive capacity of the economy. Now, here it comes Ricardo with the theory of comparative advantage, and this is the most insightful theory in trade, and that is a country can gain from imports even if it's able to produce the imported good more efficiently. Now, you use a simple model. If you take a course in just the Econ 101, they generally show that to you. But the implication of this theory is profound. It says every country means regardless of their size, their wealth, their productivity, and their endowment of natural resources, or technology, technological advance, regardless of any of those, every country, regardless of its circumstances, can produce something at a lower cost than other countries. This is something hard to believe. I know, it's counterintuitive. The theory of comparative advantage is still not understood or accepted by a lot of people, especially intellectuals. This is the reason that Paul Krugman published an essay in 1998. You can easily find it on the internet. It's called Ricardo's Difficult Idea. This is just a couple of sentences from the essay. Ricardo's idea, that is the comparative advantage, is truly, madly, deeply difficult. It's not an easy subject. It is not something that you can just take a course in your first trade theory and you think you understand it. I hope you will. I did not. It took me a long time to to understand what theory of comparative advantage is all about. As well as being utterly true, immensely sophisticated. Now we're talking about just 4 numbers that Ricardo had in his model. Immensely sophisticated and extremely relevant to the modern world. Yes, it's esoteric. It's all based on assumptions, but it's relevant, as you will see in a lot of evidence that I'm going to present to you tonight. John Stuart Mill presented us with another insight. Under free trade, small countries reap most of the gains from trading with large countries. This is the opposite of what most people think. Well, under free trade, if you have restricted trade, then the equation just reverses itself, or the gains reverses itself, meaning the large country would receive most of the benefits under restricted trade, but under free trade, smaller countries. Now, again, in your first course in trade theory, you can learn that, and again, we'll get to the empirical evidence. My time is up, and I'm not sure what should I do now. Just sit down or respond to his comments?
You've got 1 more minute.
1 more minute? Okay. The foregoing are the static gains. There are also dynamic gains from trade. Now, the ones that we just said, Martin, Hume, Smith, and Ricardo, they were talking about static gains, meaning that if you're if you're a country that with restricted trade, move towards free trade, you gain all of that. There are gains from trade. But then what? Once you have free trade, there are no more gains to be had, right? So those are static. They don't continue. But then economists developed the idea that there are dynamic gains that allow a country to grow. Now we're talking about trade leading to economic growth. Probably the best book on this to read, and this is rather a difficult book to read, Grossman and Helpman, 1991. They have a lot of economic models in there, but if I can summarize it in 1 sentence, I would say trade transmits knowledge and technology across countries and causes economic growth. Okay? Just 1 more sentence, and then I sit down. This is what economic theory or theory in any academic discipline does. It provides guidance. It provides a theoretical framework, a conceptual framework, helping us understanding an extremely complex economic world.
Well, the last sentence you heard is quite right. Economic theory is designed to provide guidance. We call that propaganda. It's to convince you to act in a way that is not in your self-interest, but is diametrically opposed to it, and to think that somehow you're helping yourself. I want to talk about, hit quickly the 7 points that you made. Start with self-sufficiency. Not only Aristotle and Plato, but the United States. The guiding policy of the United States for over 150 years has been self-sufficiency in essentials, starting with agriculture and extending to oil. The converse of your becoming self-sufficient is to make other countries dependent on you. To make them dependent on you, because once they can become dependent on you, you can suddenly stop exporting food to countries that have stopped providing their own food. The United States tried to do that to China in the 1950s. Fortunately, Canada stepped in to fill the breach, and China was very grateful to Canada. Regarding the gains of trade, if you can convince people that they actually gain from trade by becoming dependent and following a course that's going to make them poorer and poorer, and you richer and richer, then you've won the international economics game. That's why you're taught international trade theory. We mentioned David Hume. What you heard of Hume is a travesty. It is true that David Hume did say the argument for free trade that you've just heard. His friends begin to write him letters. The letters have all been published in the correspondence of David Hume. He admitted it was wrong, that trade will make countries poorer, not richer. He agreed that a country following free trade is going to suffer emigration. And in the wake of Hume's writing, for a generation, Stewart, Tucker, Oswald, other people all said that the key is that if there aren't enough jobs in manufacturing, if a country is not a balanced economy and there are not jobs, there's going to be heavy immigration. Adam Smith did pick this up. He said, we've got in England all of the high technology people from Italy because they're Roman Catholic and autocratic, and you need a politically free country in order to get the immigration of skilled labor so that we can have high technology industries, and the autocratic countries cannot have high technology industries. And then we get to Ricardo with his wonderful theory of comparative advantage that Paul Krugman likes so much. And Ricardo's great mathematical example, and I go over it in detail in my chapter on trade development and foreign debt. Ricardo's example was England trading manufactures to Portugal in exchange for wine. Who would you rather be today? Would you rather be England or Portugal? Or I should say in the 19th century. England pulled way ahead. Portugal didn't pull way ahead. And Ricardo was very patronizing to Portugal. He actually had Portugal making a mathematical gain even higher than England. We know that that's just fiction. And that's what made Ricardo's theory a parallel universe theory. You can read about it in the books. The question is, why aren't you taught when you study international trade theory that you don't want to be Portugal, you want to be England. You want to be protectionist England, not free trade Portugal, because what do you do besides growing wine and tramping on the grapes in the fall? Finally, you mentioned John Stuart Mill. Again, this is a travesty. John Stuart Mill's main contribution to trade theory was talking about what happens when countries run trade deficits. Their currency depreciates, and he discussed the whole effect of running a trade deficit, of not protecting your economy, and it's going to be your currency is going to go down and down, and so you're going to get even less and less for your labor, less for capital, if you don't balance your economy sufficiently to have not only a trade balance, but an overall balance of payments, balance in investment, profit, military spending, and the rest. And he had great difficulty publishing this article. He finally published it in 1844 in his Unsettled Questions on Political Economy. He'd written it, I think, in 1828. He had problems getting it published. Just like today, if you're an economics graduate, you're going to be trying to get a job in a university, and you're going to be judged on whether you can publish in the refereed journals. The Chicago boys, the free traders and free marketers have gained such control of the refereed journals that unless you toe their line, you cannot get any discussion of any alternatives, because the Chicago boys were not mentioned here, but they had the capstone of free trade theory. You cannot convince a country to follow free trade unless you close down every university in the country that doesn't teach it. That's what the Chicago boys did in Chile. As soon as they took over with the revolution, putting in power Pinochet, they closed every university in the country except the Catholic University that had Chicago free trade theory. They also started an assassination campaign and said you cannot wean Chile away from protectionism unless you kill the land reformers and unless you assassinate the labor leaders. You can't leave the gunboats out of the picture. If you're not willing to kill everyone who disagrees with you, and control and censor in a totalitarian way the refereed journals of economics, you cannot promote free trade theory. I thought I'd better say it right out blunt. Most of my graduates, most imaginative graduates at the New School, withdrew from economics because they couldn't fit reality into the curriculum. They couldn't reform the world, because what they found, and it's even more today with graduates of monetary theory at Kansas City, it's almost impossible to break through yes, it really could be called intellectual totalitarianism of preventing any discussion of the alternative. So you don't read what Mill wrote. You don't read what David Hume wrote in his correspondence. You don't read the criticism of Ricardo. You don't realize that there was a whole other school that ended up guiding American policy, German policy, and Japanese policy, and others that actually led to their development. You're led to actually believe that by pursuing dependency and a policy that leads to chronic trade deficits, you're going to be better off. That's the trick of modern economics.
Well, I must say that I have some alternative facts to share with you. Yeah, I do. Not only some alternative facts, some alternative charts and graphs and numbers. But let me address some of the points that Professor Hudson mentioned. Some of the assertions are true, are facts, and nobody should ever deny facts. If we ever get to that point, then we're really in trouble if we deny reality. It is true, for example, that the United States in the 19th century was protectionist. But the implication from this, that the United States became the world economic superpower because of protectionism, that implication is wrong. That did not cause the rise of the United States. The United States rose because of its economic institutions, because of its political and also legal institutions, because of the US Constitution, because of granting individual liberty. Because allowed individuals to pursue entrepreneurial ambitions that they had. That was the reason. Now, did protectionism help? Perhaps. How much is hard to know. But if protectionism were a cause of economic growth, the main superpower in the 20th century should have been Brazil and Argentina. And what happened to them? Well, let me take you back to history here. You go around 1900. Argentina and Brazil were among the economic superpowers of the time. In fact, Argentina was had about the same economic development as Canada, and Brazil was not all that far behind the United States. Then what happened? Then both of them chose protectionist policies. And look where they are now. Okay? You can investigate that yourself. You cannot find, let me go to my presentation now. You cannot find even one country in the 20th century that became protectionist and also developed. You cannot. This is a fact. Let me show it to you. Now I'm going here. Two economic historians, Peter Lindert and Jeffrey Williamson. Okay? 2003. You can find their essay is published in an edited book. If you cannot find it, email me and I will send you the reference. All right? What did they do? They point out that they did not find even one country that chose to be less open to trade and factor flows in the 1990s than in the 1960s and rose in the global living standard ranks at the same time. As far as we can tell, there are no anti-global victories to report for the post-war Third World. We infer that this is because freer trade stimulates growth in Third World economies. Okay? I'm just presenting you the finding of two distinguished economic historians. Now, let me go back to the original comments that Professor Hudson made. Factor price equalization. Again, we are talking about his being right, saying that factor price equalization, if you read it and then the follow-up article that Samuelson published and another one series of articles he published and others did, are mathematical. They are very restrictive in the model, 2 countries, 2 factors of production, 2 goods, free trade and so forth, unrealistic assumptions. All right? Those are true. But the inference from those facts that the model is junk, that implication is wrong. Because what factor price equalization says, contrary to what we heard earlier, it doesn't say that it makes countries equal. It doesn't say that at all. You can read that for yourself. What it does say is that under certain conditions, what will happen is that a worker doing similar work in a country with the same productivity and another worker in another country but with similar productivity, if free trade establishes between the two, the wages of these two will converge, at the limit become equal. In 1971, Samuelson published an article called Olin Was Right. Olin was a Swedish economist. So that was the title of the article, 1971. In that article, Samuelson argued that the implication of his factor price equalization is that if countries trade with each other, their wages converge. And that has been established. I did not know that Professor Hudson would bring this up. Otherwise, I would have brought here and would have shown you the literature that shows clearly. There was an article, now that we are at it, I might as well mention it. I did one of those work myself, published it in 1989 in the Review of Economics and Statistics, which is a premier journal published by Harvard University. I don't mention this to brag, rather to mention that when you submit an article to a premier journal, it goes through a very intense review process. If you are writing junk, they are not going to publish it. Okay? You can check that out. It's a co-authored published. I had a co-author for that article. You can see that. In that article, we showed trade among European countries caused the wages in the manufacturing wages in Europe to converge. We show the graphs, we have the equations, we have the estimation and everything. Okay? You can check it out for yourself. Now, my time is up, right? A few seconds? Good. I'll take it. Whatever I have. Now, diminishing returns and increasing returns that Professor Hudson mentioned. Well, I don't know whether Professor Hudson has followed up with the literature beyond the time that he taught international trade. There is a tremendous amount of literature in international trade under the condition of increasing returns. Yeah, my time is up, but I will just mention one more thing. In fact, Paul Krugman received his Nobel Prize in economics in 2008 because of his contributions to trade theory under increasing returns. So saying that everything is based on diminishing returns is just not true. Okay? So I have a lot here to say with regard to Hume that he mentioned is a travesty. I have something to say about that, but hopefully I'll get a chance.
Well, I'm glad that you're bringing up political facts, because that really is what it's all going to come down to. It all comes down to politics. And you'd mentioned that the strength of the United States was its democratic institutions. I think that it's not democratic institutions that cause productivity or economic takeoff, but they are indeed a precondition. And the countries that are unsuccessfully protectionist, that you mentioned quite correctly, Argentina and Brazil, why didn't protectionism work for them? Why didn't they take off in the same way that the United States took off, or Britain took off, or Germany? And the reason is absolutely right, political. They are oligarchies. And the question is, if you're going to be protectionist, what are you going to protect? The idea in the United States was that you protect what you don't, you protect an industry that you want to create. There were not that many manufacturers in the United States because under British rule, when we were colonies, they prevented any kind of industry here. You couldn't make hats, you couldn't make clothes, you couldn't make anything that would compete with Britain. And the ultimate application of this is what England did from India. You could have cited India as being way, way ahead of England in the 17th century. That was the richest country in the world. That was producing the textiles. And British control wrecked in India and left India so that even today, the corruption that you have is certainly blocking it. So what we're really talking about is the inability of economic models to be realistic if they do not take into account the political structure of the country and the oligarchy or the aristocracy, and what do you protect? Of course, if you look at the countries and compared 1990s to the 1960s, you're going, that statement is a kind of tunnel vision statement that's pure trickery. Look at what happened in the 1990s to the Soviet Union. They invited American neoliberals over. And you saw what happened. It was President Putin said quite correctly that adopting neoliberal economics killed more Russians than the Germans killed in World War II. That the Russian population plunged, life expectancy plunged, immigration rose, drug addiction rose. It was an absolute disaster of dismantling, privatizing natural resources, dismantling industry, and becoming a raw materials exporter, which I think some American diplomats said it's just a gas station with an atom bomb. Compare that to Korea, and most of all to China. Look at what they've done with a balanced economy. Look at how they've pulled ahead. And I can assure you, when I talk to students in China, the feeling that they have, that they can actually change the country, that they can get rid of the corruption that exists, that they can clean things out, it's remarkably. You're in Latin America, you're protecting your vested interests. The United States didn't protect the vested interest. The vested interest at the time that we began protectionism with the Civil War was the Southern slave economy. We didn't protect them. We created new interests that in time, of course, became protectionists. Of course, we're protecting their rent. That's why America took the lead in creating anti-monopoly regulation, in preventing protectionism from simply protecting revenue without work and without investment. The idea of protectionism was not only to increase capital investment, but to be pro-labor by realizing that you needed to have a prosperity of enough labor so that, as Henry Ford said, they could afford to buy the cars that they produced. That wasn't the case in Latin America. It was the case in the successfully protectionist countries, such as America, Germany, and most of all, China today. For Krugman, what can one say? I hate to say it, but the Nobel Prize is a public relations prize. It's a public relations for free enterprise. Quite frankly, it's public relations for mainly junk economics. That's why the Chicago boys that are on the Nobel Prize Committee keep giving it the prize to each other. It's for people that share the body of unrealistic assumptions that if you take it, it will lead to economic suicide. That, unfortunately, is what the Nobel Prize is for.
let me address the very last point first. For anyone knowing Paul Krugman, reading his twice weekly columns in the New York Times, don't know that he's not a friend of free markets. Everyone should know that. If you look at he's not a friend of free markets. He's not a free market economist. He actually has written quite extensively against the Chicago economics you're talking about. Okay? He doesn't like them. He disagrees with their viewpoint. He is highly interventionist, except in international trade. Even in international trade, that he's a free trader, he also believes that government should help workers who are displaced by imports. So that was the last point. Let me also say that I completely agree with Professor Hudson on the importance of political institutions. In fact, I highly recommend a book that came out about 4 years ago. I'm sure many of you have heard of it, perhaps even read it, by Daron Acemoglu and James Robinson. The title of the book is Why Nations Fail. The book, now you can get it paperback for maybe like $10, $12 from Amazon, is a highly readable book and a highly intelligent and informative book because they make the argument that political institutions are just as important as economic institutions. And they actually criticize the economics profession, just as Professor Watson did, that economists have left out the politics out of their economics model. Well, they bring it in. Now, they don't have any mathematical model. They have done it in some of their other published works in economic journals. You can easily find them in American Economic Reviews, has published a series of articles by Acemoglu and Robinson on this very issue we are talking about. Okay? Now that I have a few minutes and lots of issues to talk about, with regard to Russia, that actually illustrates the point. Russia did not succeed in the transition to neoliberal, if we can call it that, economics, because they didn't have the right political system in place. So the economists who advised them ignore that point. Perhaps they should have kept it in mind. Now, with regard to Hume, that was mentioned, all of Hume's writings and correspondence are collected in one volume. It was published in 1955, and anyone interested, you can read Hume's writings for yourself, okay? And judge with regard to what he says, whether he recanted his views later on or not. I must say that Hume, as much as promoted trade among countries, was not an absolute free trader. He did recommend that the Great Britain impose some tariffs on some goods coming into England, especially from France. Now, with regard to externality that Professor Hudson mentioned, externality has also been included in trade models, in trade theory. They have taken that into account. Jagdish Bhagwati of Columbia University, back in the mid-1950s, did publish articles addressing the issue. Okay, so those are all out there for anyone to read. Now, Portugal and England, the two countries that Ricardo used in his theory of comparative advantage model, well, Portugal was not a free trader. England did become a free trader after the repeal of the Corn Laws in 1846, but Portugal did not. Portugal continued a different path, and that's the reason, just as Brazil and Argentina and a host of other countries chose a different path, and they ended up being underdeveloped. Okay? 30 seconds. That's great. Thank you. Now, let me also point out with regard to economic journals. They are not published by, there is only one journal that University of Chicago publishes, and that's Journal of Political Economy. That's it. All other journals, we are talking about American Economic Review, which is the premier journal in economics, is published by American Economic Association. And they go by the validity of the argument, by the consistency and the empirical results and so forth. It goes through a rigorous review process. And then you have the Review of Economics and Statistics by Harvard University and a host of others. So Chicago, yes, they are free market, most of them, not all of them. Not all economists in Chicago are free markets. But then what happens is that they do not control the economics profession. In fact, the vast majority of economists in Ivy League schools are not really free market economists. They believe in government intervention. I think I went over my time. I'm sorry about that.
Have some time for Q&A. So I'll ask both debaters to, if you want to take a seat here just so you can both respond when you want. Just a reminder, raise your hand for a question, and then the other Dr. Stewart will bring the microphone over.
This is for Dr. Hudson. How do you think the U.S. would benefit from Trump's protectionist policies?
Do I stand up?
Yeah, you can just stand wherever you want.
We were indeed supposed to talk about what America's advantage is. And it's significant. We just pointed out that England did turn into a free trader. Every country, once it has achieved an advantage through protectionism, always promotes free trade for other countries. They want to pull up the ladder. They want to say, do what we say, not what we did. So now the United States is a free trader, now that we have the advantage to undersell other countries in so many things, and especially we're for free financial flows. So look at the, Trump, I think, was quite right in criticizing the NAFTA policy, which was a disaster, certainly for Mexico, because the effect on Mexico of NAFTA was to flood their agricultural market with subsidized, inexpensive American food exports that ended up putting the Mexican farmers out of work. That's why so many of them were forced to come to America to work on American agricultural land. One of the objectives already in the Carter administration when NAFTA was being talked about and planned was to have maquiladoras, the very low-wage factories, right along the border, the northern border of Mexico, using very low-wage, non-unionized labor without pension rights and without social services. So the idea was to use the Mexican labor to drive down wages in the South. So NAFTA was indeed a disaster, as Trump said. Regarding what his policy is, I don't have a clue as to what it is. I can't figure out. Nobody I've talked to has a clue of what it is. He did talk about infrastructure and building something like a high-speed railroad along the East Coast. I don't know. I live on the East Coast. I live in New York City and go back to Washington. You don't want railway crossing gates for a school bus to get stuck, right in the way and hit by a 350. There's no way that they can get the right-of-way. There's no way that America can have a high-speed railroad on the East Coast. It may be on inland California if you want to go through all of the rich, fertile lands of the inland place there. But I don't see what Trump's policy really is. His criticism of policy is very good, and people think that because you can criticize a bad policy, you're somehow on the side of the good guys. He hasn't shown me he's on the side of the good guys.
Yes. This gives me an opportunity, not with regard to Trump. I'm not going to talk about him. Rather, with regard to the development. Yes, but you made some comments that leads me to some of the PowerPoints here I have. Yes, let's see here. Now, let me share with you David Dollar, an economist, a senior economist at the World Bank, 2004, divided countries into three groups. Developing countries that abandon autarky being restrictive or no trade or little trade, and globalized in the 1990s. That means they embrace export promotion. rich OECD countries that were already, like the US, more or less globalized, and the rest of the developing world that remain autarkic. And they said, no, we don't want to globalize. We don't want to trade with the US and Europe and all that. We want to produce our own goods, such as Argentina and Brazil. Well, Dollar found that globalizers grew at the rate of 5% a year. The rich countries, which are already globalized, at the rate of 2% a year. And the rest of the developing world that refused to globalize actually suffered 1% negative growth rate. Okay? Now, where do all the gains go? I know it goes to the rich and so forth and so on. So he and his co-author in 2003, this is an extensive study in the Journal of Economic Growth. I really recommend every student to read this article. This is the conclusion. I got this actually from the text of the article itself. Average income, the poorest quantile, that's the 20%, rise proportionately with average incomes, which means that if the average income rose at 5%, the bottom 20% in a sample of 92 countries spanning the last 4 decades. This is not just a few days or a few years or a few countries. 92 countries over 40 years. What happened? The 20% in the bottom of the income distribution saw their income rising as much as the average. Now, I don't know how much time I have. I can go on and on. Should I?
No, let's take another question.
All right.
I'll pose this to both of you. In every economics course I've ever taken, what I've been generally told about protectionism is that it leads to retaliatory actions, that if we have our own protectionist measures, another country will have their protectionist measures, and then everyone's made worse off. To both of you, would you argue that's a falsehood? Would you argue that's a real consequence? How would you characterize that criticism?
I can assure you, if you're a bully and hit a little guy, the little guy is not going to retaliate. America has been one of the most protectionist countries in the world. I wrote a book, Global Fracture, in the 1970s, showing how America imposed steel tariffs against all the international trade rules when they came in. America has always broken the international rules, and nobody can do anything at all. There's no retaliation. If you're a little country and do something America likes, it'll send in the hit squads or put sanctions against you. So it all depends who's doing what to whom.
Well, I actually have a PowerPoint. I'll get to these graphs later, okay? Where are you? Okay, here. Please look at this very last one. Okay, why not protecting domestic industries? Well, the first answer is what you had been told in the trade theory or your economics course, that retaliation will destroy jobs in the export sector. But let's assume that the other country is even too little to retaliate, or too afraid, maybe, to retaliate, or they are very nice guys and they don't retaliate. They want to play by the rules, okay? What happens? But even without retaliation, less imports leads to lower supply of dollar on world markets. That means higher value of dollar, and that means less exports, and therefore job destruction in the export sector. So there is no way out of this. You import less by restrictive policies, you're going to end up exporting less. Save jobs in the import competing industries, lose jobs in
industries. That's not what America did, or England, or Japan, or Germany. They protected industries they didn't have, but that they want to create. If you protect a existing industry, you're enabling its owners to extract monopoly, especially if they're owned by American investors, by the way. The Americans love to protect foreign monopolies that they own. But the countries that had successful protectionism used it to create capital, to change the distribution between capital and labor, to change the comparative advantage, not to work within the existing comparative advantage between haves and have-nots. The idea is to change the world, not to work within it.
Actually, as you can guess, yeah, I can't resist it. I have to share with you these graphs because they were even amazing to me. All right? Does globalization reduce poverty? We're talking about little guys, small countries, low-income countries. Well, ask Jeffrey Sachs. Sachs, in his book, The End of Poverty, 2005, very good book to read. Easy book to read, actually. And that's unusual for an economist to write an easy book to read. Globalization, more than anything else, has reduced the number of extreme poor in India by 200 million and in China by 300 million since 1990. Now, this actually is over a decade of 1990. So his data ends in 2000, the year 2000. So since that time, in the last 15, 16 years, the poverty rate in those countries has gone down. Well, I decided to look into this. So what I did was I took China. Okay, my data actually ends in 2005. The blue line, is this blue? Does that look blue to you? The blue line is the trade ratio. Trade ratio is import plus export divided by the GDP of the country. Okay, as you can see, this one is India going up, the poverty rate going down. The same you can see for China, but even more dramatically. Look at Brazil and look at Chile. Okay, these are two countries in South America. Now you can see that as trade ratio, even in Brazil with its protectionist policies, even with its meager economic growth, trade more, you cannot really do better than this. This looks like too good to be true. The correlation between the two is almost perfect for Brazil and for Chile. And you think I'm picking on these two countries. Look at the two countries in Africa. We have Kenya and Rwanda. You can still see that whenever trade ratio goes up, trade more, your poverty rate goes down. Okay? Now, in order to make sure that this is not a biased sample, I ran some regression analysis or regression equations here. And as you can see, the percentage change in trade ratio, percentage change in economic growth, well, as you learn in your econometrics course, if you see a correlation, it doesn't mean that one is causing the other one. Maybe something else is causing both of them. Maybe something causing both poverty to go down and trade ratio to go up. And that's why I threw in the percentage change in economic growth. And lo and behold, both are negative and actual equal size and statistically significant, meaning different from zero. Sample size, 76 countries over the period of 1980 to 2005.
Wonder if you could go back to the David Dollar slide here. I want to speak I served as the chief technical advisor to the State Planning Commission of the People's Republic of China for macroeconomic reform for 4 years in the 1990s. So I learned something about that economy. One thing I can tell you is that those trade numbers, the trade shares, are utterly unrealistic. You're talking about a country of 1.3 billion people. It is not possible for a country of that scale to be exporting and importing 70% of their GDP in any reasonable volume construction. Your number's right up there. On the chart you were just showing, I looked at them. You go and look at what your trade ratios are for China. It's a preposterous number. Even if it's 50%, it's much too high. Right there, China. I have 80% trade ratio there. That is utterly preposterous. No, Swaziland or Rwanda or Belgium might have a number like that, a country the scale of China. It is absolutely not possible. No, wait, I understand that what the figures are. I'm just telling you that they do not represent any reasonable construction of production volumes in China. But let's go back to the David Dollar point slide, because I want to make a point about that and get your comment on it. Could we go to that one? No, well, my main point has to do with David Dollar. He divides the world into three categories: a category that grew very fast called globalizers, and a category that was the rich countries, leave them out, and the rest a negative 1%. And you already identified Argentina, Brazil, the so-called non-globalizers. But if you think about the relationship of these countries to the world financial sector, it's absolutely the reversed. Argentina, Brazil, much of Africa, Southeast Asia were entirely open to global finance in the 1970s and accumulated enormous debts on which they were obliged largely to default in the early 1980s, and they suffered 2 decades of negative growth. China, India also to a certain extent, were substantially insulated from the global financial sector. One of the things the Chinese did not do in the middle 1990s, thanks to the recommendation in part of a distinguished American economist, Robert Eisner, was to liberalize their capital account and open up to global finance. So I wonder if we talk about globalization in financial rather than in these rather, I think, strained trade terms, we get exactly the opposite characterization from that which David Dollar is offering here. China and India appear as less globalized, and the countries that did poorly appear as far more globalized and open to commercial banking and financial disaster than the countries that were less so. And I wonder if you could comment on that.
That may very well be true, but no, as I said before, facts are facts, and I'm not going to deny that or argue about them. What I can say about Dollar work is that it was a published work. When I read it, I was actually surprised by these results. As far as I recall, he does not talk about the financial liberalization. He talks about only liberalization in goods and services. Now, you have a legitimate point. I guess that can get published, and whether it will refute his results or will confirm it, I don't know. I haven't looked at the financial liberalization, or just for goods and services. With regard to China, the graph that you mentioned, that these appear to be too high.
Well, what's going on in China is that the pricing of exports and imports in global terms is for much smaller volumes than produced internally. And anybody who knows the Chinese economy knows this to be true.
Let me say that for many countries, that ratio is actually over 100%. And the reason is, and here is the reason, that the trade ratio adds export to the imports. It's not export minus imports, which you have in your GDP equation, is export plus import. So when you add them up, you could get a very large number.
But China is not exporting 40% of its physical volumes. It's not importing 40% of its physical volumes.
Well, I got the numbers could be wrong, but this is where I got them, and I can share with you
One needs to understand that there's a pricing problem.
Yeah. That could very well be. That very well could be the case. Yeah.
Dr. Hudson, I've done a little bit of research in the past on protectionist theory versus comparative advantage theory. There's a lot of literature on the internet that is pro-comparative advantage theory. It almost seems like comparative advantage theory is the popular opinion. So can you give us an example from history or a situation where the benefits of protectionist theory are the most apparent?
I wrote a whole book about that. America's Protectionist Trade-Off has a whole list of economists that are probably not brought up in the courses you study in trade theory. The United States is an example of setting probably the best example is agriculture in the 1930s. The ideal of the Roosevelt administration was to revive American agriculture. You had the parity pricing system and import quotas. Essentially, it was very much like the British Corn Laws of the 8 Napoleonic Wars. And I'll give you an example of no matter how irrational the agricultural protectionism, the extension services, the educational services, the seed services of the United States have been, agriculture had in the United States since from 1930 through the 1970s and maybe into the 80s had the highest productivity of any industry in history over that time. Amazing rise in productivity. The issue goes way back to the debate between Malthus and Ricardo. And most of the trade theory books that you get probably are not going to mention Malthus. And Ricardo argued, was the lobbyist for the bankers of his day, and the bankers made their profits on international trade. And he said he was all for England importing cheap enough food so that its labor could be subsist at a low enough price that they could undersell manufacturers in other countries. And therefore, he said, we've got to get rid of the corn laws that are producing economic rents for the landlords. Well, Malthus, who's not very popular for many good reasons, said, wait a minute, the landlords, what are they going to use the rents for? He said they're going to use, because they can make so much profit on grain, they're going to use the rents protected by the corn laws to invest in agricultural modernization and developing the soil. And that was why British agriculture was able to expand and feed the population during the Napoleonic Wars. Now, here you had, at the time of Ricardo wrote this idea, he based the whole theory on diminishing returns. And this is in a time when you had the birth of agricultural chemistry, you had Justus von Liebig, you had Tare, you had agricultural chemistry, you had the mechanization of agriculture, and you had sort of agribusiness developing. The whole technological transformation of the 19th century that was happening in Ricardo's day was missed because he said, don't look at reality, look at my model. It's going to pay us bankers. Basically, I'm summarizing his politics there. But how do you explain how America's protectionist agriculture that has been the base of all policy? And you've cited policies by the World Bank, probably the most anti-development, the most detrimental organization in modern history has been the World Bank. Its job was to block self-sufficiency in food production by third world countries, to subsidize plantation export agriculture instead of feeding their own culture, to only give foreign currency loans to develop roads and the infrastructure for an export plantation infrastructure, but not domestic currency loans, which is what you need to modernize domestic agriculture. So the World Bank promoted constant latifundia, not macrofundia, not family-owned farming. It ended up promoting agricultural backwardness and doing more damage to the world than many world wars have done.
Okay, I'm going to give you the last.
Okay. Just one quick point. Ricardo's theory of comparative advantage is based on constant returns to scale, not diminishing returns. Professor Hudson is right that Ricardo wrote much of his economic analysis based on diminishing returns, but not the theory of comparative advantage. That was constant returns to scale. I have some concluding remarks. It will take a few minutes. Do we have a few minutes?
Just a couple.
Just a couple, okay. All right, I'm going to forego the first paragraph. How about that? Okay. Consider the following. The state of Connecticut, where I live, imports petroleum products from Texas, where you live. And Texas imports laser products from Connecticut. And they do this without any barriers erected by state governments or without negotiating trade treaties. But to exchange goods and services with Mexico, Canada, China, or Germany, or any other country, we insist on trade treaties. We insist on negotiation. There is no rational basis for this. just as there is no rational basis for negotiating trade treaties among states within the Union. In fact, the US Constitution has rendered that unconstitutional. The economic case for free trade is unilateral, meaning remove all trade barriers on other countries' goods and services, regardless of what they do. This is what the economics theory as well as evidence shows us. However, the case for free trade is not limited to economic gains. John Stuart Mill stated, quote, "The economical advantage of commerce are surpassed in importance by those of its effects, which are intellectual and moral." Let me take you back a couple of thousand years. Augustus, the Roman emperor, said, "Suppress commerce and you tear apart the bonds of human race." Montesquieu, closer to our time, said, "The spirit of commerce unites nations." Benjamin Rush, a signer of the US Declaration of Independence, he said, he viewed commerce as the means of uniting different nations of the world. The European Union was established primarily, not the only reason, but primarily to create peace among European powers. And today, no one can imagine that the EU countries would be fighting with each other, although they might fight non-members such as Russia. Last one, okay, only 30 seconds or less. The fundamental question we must raise is whether the nation, our nation, other nations overall, and the world overall is better off. This is the question we should ask. Are we better off under free trade or a restrictive and protectionist one? While free trade is not a panacea, it's not. Free trade is not going to cure all of our economic ills. And trade is not about creating jobs, unlike what we hear from our politicians. The overwhelming evidence indicates that protectionism and isolationism result in corruption, stagnation, even negative economic growth, poverty, and international conflict. To borrow from Winston Churchill's characterization of democracy, globalization is the worst system except for all others.
We're out of time. That's it.
Don't have the last word? I thought you said I would.
No, he gets the. You got the first word. He gets the last word. But I want to thank you all for being a very good audience tonight, and we both of these speakers gave us a lot to think about. But they not only gave us a lot of economics to think about, but especially in an age where what characterizes debate, especially as seen on television, is just two people shouting at one another. I really appreciate these two modeling mature civil disagreement, the way grown-ups should disagree about things. And so I think we should give them our thanks for that. A couple of last announcements. The Austin Institute has many other events, both large in scale like this one and smaller ones. Nick and Deanne over here will be outside the doors. If you want to sign up for our email list so that you know about these sorts of debates and then other activities, they will be there. They will be there to get your email address. I also want to say that Professor Hudson has very generously brought some books. So if some of the ideas that he had piqued your interest, come up to him afterwards and talk to him about his books that are here. And maybe you can talk him out of one of them. So thank you all very much, and we'll see you next time.